Shannon Bream's new book discusses even more women of the Bible. And I love this. This is a perfect book, not just for, I think, the era, but also, of course, for the week in which we find ourselves. And Shannon Bream of Fox News joins us now over the phone. Shannon, congrats on the new book. And I love the scope of this. Congratulations.
Dana, thank you so much. And thanks for having me. And I love that you point out Deborah, because I was working on the chapter and editing the chapter about her as I was sitting in the confirmation hearings for Justice Barrett. So it was one of those really weird moments where everything sort of comes together in a nutshell.
What an amazing time, because you're there right there in that period and you're kind of seeing it in some ways. I mean, there were so many things that there were so many similarities when you were watching that confirmation, and everyone was discussing Amy Coney Barrett, who's a devoted mother, a very faithful woman. And that's a pretty amazing time. I always, when I hear stuff like that, I'm like, that's a God thing. You're sitting there and you're editing that chapter particularly. I love this. And I love the positivity of the books that you write, but I wanted to ask you specifically, why focus on the women of the Bible? Did you feel that there wasn't enough exploration of how really powerful and influential women, really the part that they played in biblical times and in the establishment of Christianity? I wanted to get your perspective on why you chose this path.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of folks out there who have misconceptions about faith or about the Bible, that it's this dusty old rule book, it's a bunch of old guys and it's boring. And I wanted to bring it to life because, listen, I don't have to add anything to these stories. They are amazing page turners in their own right. And I grew up hearing most of them in Sunday school and in church. So I was very familiar with most of these stories. But I found as I dug into them and, asked questions of theological experts about what were the customs of the time, what's the context for these women, what does this word mean in Hebrew or Greek? I mean, I learned so much. And I thought these stories are included for a reason. God wanted them in the Bible. They do show women who are strong, who are leaders, who are faithful, who are courageous. I wanted to include some people who are pretty flawed, though, too.
Yes.
I'm half joking, but we do have a prostitute. We've got a murderer in here along with the queen. Just showing that God works through every situation and through every story when we're willing to be a part of his plan.
I love that you touched on that as well, because there were a lot of, we're talking with Shannon Bream of Fox News and her new book out, The Women of the Bible Speak, because that's so incredibly true. I mean, the flaws are not hidden in Scripture. I mean, they are out there for everyone to see. And you really get to see too, and this is something that when one of the studies that my kids had in their youth groups, you really get to see, all of these flawed people that Jesus comes from. And I think of, particularly with Leah and her story, and it was, from her tribe, that's where Jesus comes from, and all these flawed individuals. And the women are flawed just as much as the men are, but there's that redemptive arc that plays into every single one of these stories. And that's the point that you highlight.
Yeah, and I love that, because some of these women in the book get way off track. They make crazy, questionable at best decisions. They want to take things into their own hands. Like we've all done it at some point. We get impatient, or we think, let me just help you out, God. I've got a great plan here for you, as if he doesn't have it already figured out. So these women do some questionable stuff, but even in that, as you said, he's redeeming it. We see these women who are in the lineage of Christ, so leading us to the Savior in the New Testament. Even though in the Old Testament they made some bad decisions, God was able to redeem that. And in the New Testament, I love the focus on the relationship that Jesus had with women. Again, I think it's a myth-busting kind of situation where he saw them as equals. They studied with him. They were part of his ministry. They were his friends and part of his inner circle. And that wasn't really the norm for those times. So I love that he has great respect for these women, and there's nothing second class about them at all. And he highlights and points the disciples to many of these women and points to them and says, that's who you should emulate. About, for example, the widow in the temple who gave what she had. It was so small compared to everybody else who's marching in there to present their giant gifts. But they gave out of an abundance. And Jesus pointed the disciples to that widow woman who gave almost nothing and said, she's the biggest giver. That's the one you want to follow, because she gave almost everything she had. And it was of a real sacrifice to her. So he highlighted women, and they're drawn all throughout the Old and New Testaments for a reason.
Yeah, I love that. We're speaking with Shannon Bream, whose new book, The Women of the Bible Speak. And I loved how you were talking about some of the mythbusters with this, because this time last year, and I think it was maybe Easter weekend or the week leading up, there was this huge discussion with third wave feminists and the sexism in the Bible. And I just kept thinking, they're missing the point of when, after the resurrection, it was the women who Jesus told first. It was the women who saw him first during a time when women were not believed as men were in a court of law or even in society. And it was the women who were told to go and tell the disciples and go and make the public aware, which is so unbelievably significant. And as you said, Mythbuster, that's something that does not get the attention that it is due.
And it's such a great point you make, Dana, because yes, back in those days, if you would go into court or have a legal dispute, women were not valued as witnesses. So for the Bible to come together and the disciples and various authors of the Bible to say it was a woman who first saw Jesus at the tomb, he later appeared to the disciples and to other people. But yeah, Mary Magdalene had gone there in such grief and discovering that his body was gone. She was so overcome, she didn't even realize Jesus was standing there. She thought she was talking to a gardener. And she was like, just tell me where you've taken his body. That's all I want to know. And he says her name. He says Mary. And she immediately knows who it is. And I can't imagine the overwhelming joy after having such grief to realize that it was him. And so, yeah, he revealed himself to her. She essentially becomes the first evangelist now, being that witness to run and tell everybody else he's alive. What he said is true. He is who he said he was.
Yeah. No, I love that. I absolutely love it. And I think I'm excited for people to read this book. We're speaking with Shannon Bream, whose new book, The Women of the Bible Speak, the Wisdom of 16 Women and Their Lessons for Today. Who is your favorite woman? If you had to just narrow it down to one woman that you profiled, one woman from the Bible that you discussed, who was the one that really, I think that touched you the most, or that story spoke to you the most?
I'm not going to lie. This is really difficult. I change my answer every day on this, but I really love Deborah so much because here she was, the leader of the nation of Israel. Women were valued for their leadership. She was leading the entire nation. They came to her to settle their disputes. She was a judge. So she's mediating all of their problems. God comes to her and says, you're going into battle against the Canaanites. And this was a nation that had been oppressing them. They were horrible, horrible people. They were doing violent, vicious things. And Israel's way outmanned and outgunned by this, by way of, chariots and all kinds of other things that the world would say, this is not an even match on the battlefield. She calls up her general who leads the Israelite army, Barak, and says, okay, God has said we're supposed to go into battle against the Canaanites. And Barak's sort of like, okay, I will do this, but only if you go with me. Because he knew she was anointed. And she's like, all right, I'll go. But because you made that condition, the leader of the opposing army is actually, that general is going to be delivered into the hands of a woman who is another important character that we include in the book. And you see that story come together. So they went into battle and they had this enormous victory that could have only been done by divine intervention. So I want to be more like Deborah, somebody who is respected, who is a leader, but somebody who, when God asked her to do something that to the world made no sense, she didn't question it. She just did it. And it was a victorious decision.
Yeah, I love it. This is such a great book, and especially for a time such as this, when everything seems just awful, and the news every day is, how can people get meaner? It just seems like that's what the headlines are. Yeah, how can people get meaner today? That's the top news story. So this is great to have just this positivity. And for people who don't know, I mean, Shannon, a devout Christian, and I read that you went to Liberty University, and that's for my oldest son. That's one of the ones that we had looked at when he was graduating high school. So, but it's I love this, and I'm very excited to dive into this book, and congrats on all of this. Shannon Bream, the book is The Women of the Bible Speak, the Wisdom of 16 Women and Their Lessons for Today. This is fantastic, and congratulations again, my friend, and all of the success and luck to you. And we enjoy watching you every evening. You're on in our house Monday through Friday. So we appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Yeah,
Shannon.
Come back soon.
I will. The next time I'm in DC, I'll make a point. I'll reach out and holler.
Good deal.